Holla ballers, what's going on? It's Preacher and I'm here to answer one little thing that people like to ask me. Is Preacher, should I roll a mage? Well, we're going to talk about that today and we're going to jump into all the little aspects. I have lumped all three specs into a single video as we're going to cover them in a kind of brief manner. We have looked at them extensively in the past. One spec I'm not going to spend too much time on, however, is fire. And the reason for that is literally about a month or so ago, I did two big videos regarding fire. One looking at the fire playstyle in its absolute entirety, and some good aspects and some bad aspects of that as well. And I also did a huge video on how to use combustion, the big fire DPS cooldown, okay? One thing I will want people to bear in mind as we go into the other specs, which are of course Frost and Arcane, is that fire does have its huge moments of glory. We'll talk a little bit about it, but in general, look at those two videos in the background if you're looking for more detailed information regarding fire. First of all, the Mage. Let's talk a little bit of history of the Mage. The history of the Mage, if you're considering rolling this, is mages tend to either be really, really good or really, really shit. Okay, that is generally the way the pendulum swings with the Mage, which is unusual, right? Because they have three separate specs, all dedicated to DPS, and as such, you would think that in general, those specs, one of them is always going to perform rather well. Classically, that hasn't always been the case. However, with the modifications to Mist of Pandaria and sort of bringing Frost back into the fold in terms of its PvE possibilities and not being a sort of dedicated PvP spec, this kind of has died away of this idea of mages just being completely garbage. If we look back towards the end of the Burning Crusade, Sunwell time, mages were dramatically bad. I mean, really, really bad. And that also transferred to the beginning of Cataclysm as well. The beginning of Cataclysm. The big reason for this is mages tend to require a lot of gear and don't have spells which generally can make up for a lack of gear. So if we compare it directly to the Warlock, sort of the omnipresent counter to the Mage, they have abilities such as their AoE is just capable of huge amounts of burst, regardless of the amount of gear you've got. You've all played one of those classes where if you pop certain abilities, it doesn't matter about your gear, you still tend to perform really, really well. Whereas a mage doesn't quite work that way. They do just base themselves on gear upon gear upon gear. Very often, no matter what style of play you're doing or what spec you're rolling, the mage still plays exactly the same regardless of gear. Only fire tends to differ somewhat as more crit, but beats out that RNG factor. That's the only kind of way. What I will say is their playstyles of all three specs are absolutely varied, and I really do appreciate that effort. It's always difficult to see as we compare it to the Hunters of the last video, where although they have three dedicated PvE specs that work, is they all play very, very similarly, and actually playing them in a different way means not a lot at all. We have one big DPS ability, we have a proc to track, and so on and so forth. That's not the case with the mages. Arcane, Fire, and Frost all play very, very differently, and this gives us a lot of mobility and a lot of variation in how we play it. I want to touch on that into how that can be reflected as bad as we move into the downsides later in the video, but it's always worth noting that Arcane, very much a single target, organized, bash you in the face style of play. We've got Fire, which is a ton of fun. You literally feel like you're burning things alive. And then we have Frost, which works in so many different ways and feels frosty. I think that's one of the biggest positives from sort of RP getting into your character style of play, is that Arcane, Frost, and Fire really suit the way they play. They really suit it. The style, the fireballs, the pyroblasts, all these huge burning abilities really suit fire. The frost aspect of having the water elemental, which is also freezing things, locking things to the ground, slowing things. These little niche abilities all play into that style. And Arcane, the people know I hate Arcane, but I'm going to talk about that later. It's not really Arcane's fault, but Arcane as well. It's a little bit sterile in places, but Arcane very, very different again from Fire and Frost. One big positive about mages is movement. Blink is simply the most powerful ability in any raid scenario you can wish for. Movement is very rarely a problem for a mage, despite the fact that, yes, while they have some abilities that can be cast on the move, and they have very, very many instant casts to abuse while moving, if it's some big, I need to get the fuck out of there, or I need to get right over there really quickly, instead of having to sort of hope to stutter step it, as we've seen with, say, a Shadow Priest, it's always ability to just blink your ass over there and get the hell over there. Talking a little bit more specifically about the positives of this, okay? Fire is in its own realm of good, and I mean that in the most positive way possible. However, fire is dependent on gear. Fire suffers immensely from RNG, because in order to pull off cool fire, you have to be critting all the time. That is just the nature of the spec, and that is how it works. However, once you have enough gear, and I'm talking upwards of nearly 40% critical strike chance, then that RNG is pushed away from the table. My mage, even at 33% raid crit buff, still suffers immensely from obscene streaks of non-critical strikes, and therefore that spec actually loses a little bit of its fun aspect. The fun in fire comes from when you're critting all the time and you become a pyroblast turret. That is when you feel godlike. That is when you are happy days and you can get obscene combustions which go along with that. Frost has another positive though. So consistent. So consistent, and the fact that it's consistent all the time makes it so strong and makes it so fun, because you're not suffering any RNG elements. Its proc is reliable based on your bombs. Ice Lances come as you expect. You can predict that when you launch that Frost Orb, you're going to get some Ice Lances coming out of that. Every single aspect of Frost is just consistent. Unfortunately, Frost does suffer from scaling, which means it's not getting as much benefit from all that extra gear as you would like to see from Fire, especially, which gets great scaling as your gear increases. What we want to see is Frost consistency, also backed up by its ability to punish and really kick ass at higher levels. Unfortunately, it just doesn't quite do that. Arcane has its positives as well, as hard as it is to imagine. If you're an Arcane mage, you have one of the most reliable abilities to smash something in the face over a very short period of time. Every time something needs to die. And I like to take us back again to Cataclysm to look at Deathwing's back, where we had to kill those tendons very quickly, a short amount of time to kill them, very short indeed, and we needed to put out obscene amounts of damage. An Arcane Mage can say, it doesn't matter what we need to do here, because I will kill your shit. I will blow you the fuck up in that short window. The combination of cooldowns and arcane power allows the Arcane to reliably, and I mean reliably, say, this is going to die. And I can make that happen. Let's talk about the downsides then. One spec tends to always win, and this generally is the biggest pain in the ass of mages. One spec tends to always win, and this suffers heavily. Okay, this really punishes mages for having such varied styles of play. On the one side, we have cool, different styles of play. The problem is players fall in love with one particular style. There are mages out there who love Arcane. There are mages who love Frost, and there are mages who love Fire. But when it comes down to it with the mage, one spec tends to always be on top. So we can say, oh, you're a high geared mage, you should be playing Fire. Oh, you're a lower geared mage, you should be playing Frost. Oh, you're in 10-man, then you should be playing Frost. Yeah, but I really like Arcane. I really like Fire. No, tough shit. This is where you are. This is what wins for you. Therefore, you'll always do that. Now, there's a lot of people who will say, well, isn't that true of most specs? It's not as if the rogues have much in the way of choice, depending on the fight. Kind of, but it's such a different style of play between them that playing a spec you do not like is really, really uncomfortable, especially when you know your class is capable of giving you a spec you really, really enjoy. And that's one kind of downside. I would say that is a big downside of mages, is they're not always, and certainly in my historical sense, have never really been equally balanced across multiple specs. And that kind of makes me really sad. It kind of makes me really sad. Let's talk about the specific downsides. Firstly, fire and its RNG. As I said, I have 32% crit chance. It's nothing special on my mage by any means. But even then, fire is an absolute boring, letdown, and frustrating spec if you are not getting reliable crits. But in general, fire is just so fun to play that you will hope to God that you don't have those periods in a fight where you cannot get off those consistent pyroblasts. Because when you do, oh man, you'd wish you were playing any other spec. When it comes to Frost, it is the scaling issue we spoke about earlier. Frost is just so reliable that you want it to work at the top end. I would love for Frost to be the top end spec. It just isn't quite there. And that's really sad because I know no matter what happens in my encounter, Frost is going to perform. I know it's going to perform. I know that when I play Frost, my damage will be my damage, and it's not taking into account stupid things that might happen, such as really unreliable streaks of non-critical strikes. Frost just does not suffer from that. I was talking about Arcane. I guess I have to bring up again the level 90 mage talents, and motherfucking hate them. Absolutely hate them. Detest them. Mages suffer, and their worst downside, in my opinion, is that they get less fun as soon as you hit level 90. Blizzard has gone some way to try and alleviate the burden that is the level 90 talents. Now, I want that to be the point here. The level 90 talents, as they currently stand, are a fucking burden to the class. No other class in the game has such a burdensome, has such a cumbersome, has such a frustrating talent such as the level 90 mage talents. Some specs can even get away with not using their level 90 ability, but mages do not have that luxury, as it goes against everything a Blizzard claimed that the level 90 talents, and in fact all the talents, would go towards, which is things that are just flat out damage increases. Boring, sterile, spell power, or AP increases. Those are boring, Blizzard said, so why the fuck did you give us level 90 talents which increase our spell power by a flat amount and require us to do some tedious, boring situation while we are fighting? As you can probably tell, I really hate them. Firstly, Rune of Power. Now, why I left Arcane from the previous downsides is simple as this. Rune of Power is required to play an Arcane Mage. If you want to play an Arcane Mage, which works on the idea of having high amounts of mana in order to produce increased amounts of damage, you realistically have to use Rune of Power. Because Rune of Power is increasing your mana over a period of time, therefore giving you more consistent high amounts of mana. Rune of Power is the most useless fucking ability I have ever seen in my life, especially when it comes to things like the Throne of Thunder. The problem with Rune of Power is this. Is it quick to cast? Yes. Yes, it is. But you have to stand in it. You can have two. That's kind of helpful. In the Throne of Thunder, there is in every single encounter the requirement to move on a consistent basis. If we could cast a Rune of Power and leave it there for its duration and stand still, it would be not as bad. But bear in mind, I mean not as bad. It's still bad to stick your character to the floor in order to have an increased amount of damage and to recast that ability during the fight. It's not fun, it's irritating. So with a Rune of Power, you have to be stood in it. Every time you are uncontrollably made to move, which is all the damn time in Throne of Thunder. There is barely a fight in there where you can stand consistently still for at least a minute. It just does not happen. You are knocked around, moved around, and where a good player can make use of being knocked around and moving around, the Rune of Power Arcane Mage cannot do that, because when he moves, be it by blink, he then has to recast his Rune of Power, and he has to keep doing that, which makes it the most tedious thing in the world. Invocation. Invocation was the solution to this problem, right? The solution. It's super quick to cast and it keeps your buff up for a nice amount of time. What's the problem with that? It's still a pain in the ass. No matter which way you look at it, it is still a pain in the ass that every now and again I have to stop doing what I am doing and start casting Invocation. And I still get knocked back in the middle of my Invocation. Therefore I have to cast it again, which is just a huge pain in the fucking ass. I detest these level 90 talents with a passion. I don't understand them, right? I don't understand why mages are being burdened once again with the idea of resource management. Now, you might say, well, there's some classes that have resource management. Yes, but in a cool way. Let's look at the Warlocks. Their resource management is really fun. And no two ways about it. Managing soul shards, managing your burning embers, and managing your demon form are fun because when you get to use your resources, you get to do something really fucking cool. And it's not a pain in the ass. They regenerate naturally. There are ways of increasing their generation rate, which makes your class more interesting. Other classes who have a resource in some fashion either have it completely ignored, such as in the case of Rep Paladins, or it's a mandatory ability that you're generating anyway, such as focus or energy. You are naturally generating this resource. Your management tends to come from not spamming it. That's alright. Why the fuck do mages have to care about mana in this day and age? And I know that sounds weird. A mage should care about mana, right? Because you're a caster. Think about every other caster in this game right now. Caster DPS, range DPS. Ask yourself this. Do they give a shit about mana? Does a Shadow Priest give a shit about mana, or does he give a shit about his Shadow Orbs? Does an Elemental Shaman give a shit about his mana, or does he consider his Fulmination procs? Mana is fine as a resource if it allows us to do something fun. If our level 90 mage talents, and in fact, the interesting thing is that your mana gets fucked when you hit level 90, so you have to use your level 90 mage talents. It's so sad. It's depressing. And it really pisses me off. So there's my rant. Should you roll a mage? If you haven't rolled one yet, I'm not sure I could say go ahead and do it, from my personal opinion, because I know some people love the mage, and God bless you, but quite frankly, I just cannot stand playing my mage at level 90. It pisses me off when I know what else is out there that doesn't have this ridiculous notions, that doesn't have these cumbersome abilities. But I will say this. It's probably going to change in the next expansion. It doesn't look like they're going to change it for 5.4, and most people playing a mage have just gotten used to it. If you're going to get used to it, go ahead and do it. Right now, I would say play a mage up to level 89 because it is an absolute blast. It is a total blast. The mage is so much fun. When it gets to level 90, though, there are going to be situations that you bump into that you're just not going to like. And most of them will come down to your level 90 mage talents. That's it, guys. Should you roll a mage? I leave it to you. I'm not going to be overly positive on this one, but you take it easy, and I'll see you again.